Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Well, hi everybody, and welcome to The Examined Life with Phil. I'm Phil, and this is my attempt to examine my life and get you to examine yours. So this week I'm going to be talking about something that I've termed the argument against evolution from morality, which I'm not really attached to that term, so if you can think of a better one after you listen to the podcast, write in, let me know. This is an idea that, as far as I know, is original to me. I haven't heard anybody else give this before, and it's something I hope to turn into an essay or more formal argument at some point. But since I'm going through this whole series on creation, evolution-related things, I thought, hey, this would be an appropriate venue to make a podcast out of it, get some of these ideas out, and see what works and what doesn't. So that's what I'm going to be talking about this week. Before I get into that, I have two quick announcements, and then I'll give out a Facepalm and Sigh award as well, because those are always so much fun. First announcement is, as I've been mentioning for a while, that there's going to be a debate between David Van Beber and I on the nature of inerrancy, and we're both really excited about this. David and I have been talking about this, ironing out the details, and as I think I've mentioned several times, he's a cordial gentleman, so we're going to be able to have a very good, edifying exchange, even though we disagree on some of the aspects of inerrancy. And if you want to know more about how we disagree, well, I've got some podcasts about that. David runs his own podcast called the Tag Your It podcast, where he's talked about it on there. You can go look at it there. Or even better yet, come to the actual debate where we'll talk about it in person. It's going to be on January the 6th in the evening at 6:30 p.m., and it'll be at the Library Center in Springfield, Missouri. We haven't got the room narrowed down yet, but I know for sure that's the location it'll be at. Now, there's a couple of different libraries, public libraries in Springfield. There's actually one on the south side that's on Campbell Avenue, or maybe it's Campbell Street, that's called the Library Center, and that's where it's going to be at 6:30 on January the 6th. We're going to be doing it live and in person, and of course we're going to do a recording. I'm pretty sure David intends to put it up on his podcast, and I'll put it up on mine, so obviously some people listen here who don't live in the area of Springfield, Missouri, and you probably don't want to drive all the way across the country just for a debate between me and somebody else. And I don't blame you. I don't think I'm probably worth your time, like a whole day's drive to listen to. So we'll put it up on the podcast. But hey, if you're in the area and you're interested in issues on inerrancy, or you listen to the podcast I did on inerrancy a while back and thought, nah, Phil, you're wrong. Hey, come out to the debate, attend it, and we're going to have a Q&A session at some point, and ask me questions and point out to me where I'm wrong. So both David and I are pretty excited about this. We've been, as I said, we've been messaging each other, working out the details. We're really looking forward to it. I've never done a formal academic debate like this before, so I'm excited to do this for my first time. And David's actually, from what I understand, pretty experienced with academic debates like this, so I wouldn't be all that surprised if he gives a better debate performance than I do, but I'll do my best. And most importantly, it should be a fun, edifying exchange where we're all better off for listening to it. So that's going on. That's something that I'm really looking forward to. Next a bit is I'm pretty confident that I finally got a young Earth creationist, somebody who takes up that position, although I think this person prefers to call herself a biblical creationist, but somebody who takes a position that the Earth is quite young, lined up to come on the podcast. We're negotiating the details a little bit through messaging and stuff, and it might take a couple of weeks to make that happen. But I think I finally got somebody secured. So when I can get that person on here, we can have that discussion. I should then be able to round out this series on creation, evolution, and science. And so I'll do a wrap-up episode like I always do, and then I'll move on to another topic, which I haven't really picked yet. We'll just see. So for this week's Facepalm and Sigh Award, I'm going to give this out to the physicist Sean Carroll. Now, this is an article that was published on express.co.uk, and the headline is, "There is no life after death. Scientists insist that afterlife is impossible." Now, Sean Carroll is a cosmologist and physics professor at the California Institute of Technology, and I'll just read you parts of the article here. He says he believes he has put the debate surrounding the afterlife to bed after extensively studying the laws of physics. Dr. Carroll states, the laws of physics underlying everyday life are completely understood, and everything happens within the realms of possibility. He says that for there to be an afterlife, consciousness would need to be something that is entirely separated from our physical body, which it is not. Rather, consciousness at the very basic level is a series of atoms and electrons which essentially give us our mind. The laws of the universe do not allow these particulars to operate after our physical demise, according to Dr. Carroll. He claims, and the article quotes him here, claims that some form of consciousness persists after our bodies die and decay into their constituent atoms face one huge, inseparable obstacle. The laws of physics underlying everyday life are completely understood, and there's no way within these laws to allow for the information stored in our brains to persist after we die. For evidence, Dr. Carroll points to quantum field theory. In simple terms, the quantum field theory is the belief that there is one field for each type of particle. For example, all the photons in the universe are on one level, all the electrons too have their own field, and every other type of particle too. Dr. Carroll explains if life continued in some capacity after death, tests on quantum field would have revealed spirit particles and spirit forces. He writes in Scientific America, it's really nothing but atoms and the known forces. There's clearly no way for the soul to survive death. Believing in life after death, to put it mildly, requires physics beyond the standard model. More importantly, we need some way for that new physics to interact with the atoms we have. Within quantum field theory, there can't be a collection of spirit particles and spirit forces that interact with our regular atoms because we would have detected them in existing experiments. Once this is accepted by all scientists, Dr. Carroll says they can truly begin to understand how the human mind operated. He said, there's no reason to be agnostic about ideas that are dramatically incompatible with everything we know about modern science. Once we get over any reluctance to face reality on this issue, we can get down to much more interesting questions of how human beings and consciousness really work. Now, I'd actually heard of Sean Carroll before I came across this article. I saw somebody sharing it on Facebook and looked it up. He debated William Lane Craig on essentially the cosmological argument for the existence of God back in 2014. The debate was actually supposed to be a bit broader than that, but if you go listen to it, it's more or less about the cosmological argument where Craig is saying, yeah, this gives us good cause to believe in God, and Carroll's saying, no, it doesn't. Now, Carroll's actually making two very, very big philosophical errors here, which I'm quite surprised by, because my understanding is Dr. Carroll actually has an undergraduate degree in philosophy and then went on to do his work in astrophysics, cosmology, and physics in graduate and doctorate level work. So he should have a good basis for understanding the basic logic of these things and not be making these types of errors. And so if you've been listening to the podcast regularly and you heard my breakdown of scientism, you should immediately be able to pick up, he's assuming scientism. He's assuming that understanding physics will explain everything. That if there is an afterlife, it's something we can explain in terms of physical reality, in terms of matter, in terms of material, in terms of quantum physics. Because even though when you think of things like fields in quantum physics, that doesn't invoke the same feeling of matter as, say, the table, the computer and mic I'm speaking to, using to record the podcast is on. Well, strictly speaking, quantum fields are a material substance. They're an aspect of matter. They're an aspect of physics. And so what Dr. Carroll's assuming there is, if for there to be an afterlife, for human consciousness to survive death, it has to be explained in terms of physics, in terms of material. Which is also the other fallacy that comes in, is that's more or less begging the question. What he kind of wants to prove here is there's no afterlife. And so, in assuming that everything has to be explainable in terms of material, that is, stuff we can research through the hard sciences, Carroll's falling into the trap of scientism. This is a very good example of scientism and how it leads to all kinds of philosophical errors, especially from somebody who has the education that he should know better. The other problem with this is this argument is an example of begging the question. So what Carroll's essentially trying to prove here, or argue here, is, well, there's no afterlife. There's nothing that's immaterial about human beings. We're reducible to the atoms and quantum components in our brain. Everything that is that about our thoughts, our intentions, and our feelings can be explained in terms of physics. Therefore, there can't be an afterlife. But I'm sure But as I hope you can see here, he pulled a little bit of a sleight of hand and begged the question. That is, he assumed that well, all human beings are is physical stuff. Therefore, or we're not immaterial, therefore there can't be an afterlife. He assumed an aspect of his conclusion in order to prove his conclusion. So as I often try to do here to help explain how these fallacies work, let's put his argument into some type of formal argument to help us better understand. I'm going to try and do this as charitably as I can, so if somebody's listening and they think I've misconstrued his argument or I made a mistake, well, I'm trying to do it in good faith, so write in and tell me where I went wrong. And if Dr. Carroll, if you're listening and you think I've misconstrued it, write in and tell me where I went wrong. I'm trying to do this in good faith. So his argument seems to be something along the lines of, if there is an afterlife, if there is something after death, that must be explainable in terms of physics and material things, either at the quantum level or in a non-standard model of physics, something along those lines. And we could call that premise one. And premise two seems to be something along the lines of, we have no evidence or cause to think that there is any such afterlife or survival of consciousness after death under our current models of physics, and our current models of physics explain everything very, very well. And so the conclusion would be then 3, therefore, there is no afterlife, nothing like that. And now I hope you can see how this isn't a very good argument. And it might be a little difficult there to see how he begged the question, because he's just assuming from the get-go everything is explainable in terms of physics and then saying we don't have evidence for this in terms of physics, therefore it's not there, it can't exist. And the trouble is, if you actually took the time to go look at what philosophers or theologians or other people who are claiming a belief in the afterlife and the immaterial of human beings actually mean by things like the afterlife and immaterial, they mean it's not material, it's not explainable in terms of physics, it's not something that you could get to even at the quantum physical level. You're not going to see any evidence of a transfer of consciousness out of the human body, even if you can monitor all the physical and chemical interactions that are going on in and around the human body at the time of death. It's not going to happen because it's supposed to be an immaterial thing, not a material thing. And so this is a much subtler example of begging the question, because the conclusion isn't explicitly in those first two premises. It's assumed by those first two premises. In a certain sense, you have to assume the conclusion, that is the idea the physical world is all there is an explicit assumption behind both the premises he's using and the conclusion he's using. So I think maybe, again, trying to be a little fair, you could then say, well, maybe begging the question isn't exactly the best way to describe this error. Rather, he's just misunderstood and misconstrued what people mean by the idea that human beings have an immaterial component and that there is an afterlife. He doesn't understand that this isn't something that's physical because he's fallen into this trap of scientism and is thinking that everything has to be explainable in terms of physics. Or maybe the other hard sciences. And that's fair. I think you could say that that's a way to do it as well. And we could actually make his argument, I think, better and stronger if you put it something along these lines. 1, everything has to be explainable in terms of physics and the hard sciences. 2, in physics and the hard sciences, we find no evidence of an immaterial aspect to human beings or an afterlife. 3, and here I'm quoting him directly, the laws of physics that underline everyday life are completely understood. Therefore, most likely, there is no afterlife and no immaterial aspect to human beings. Consciousness doesn't survive death. Now, I still don't think that's a good argument, but at least it's a valid one. Its conclusion does rationally follow from its premises. Now, hopefully you can see why it's a bad argument, because its premises are almost certainly wrong. That is, everything is not explainable by physics and the other hard sciences. That statement is self-refuting because it itself is not explainable by the physics and the hard sciences, and further, there's numerous examples of things that aren't all that easily explained by physics and the hard sciences. I did a whole episode on this called Scientism just about 2 weeks ago, so go back and listen to it if you need some more evidence of that. And secondly, the second premise is also almost certainly not true, because there's actually some evidence that there is an immaterial aspect of human beings. And there's been multiple pretty well-documented cases of people who've had what are termed near-death experiences, or NDEs, that if they don't outright demonstrate that consciousness can survive death, they come about as close to demonstrating as you're going to get. So I'd recommend, if you want some more evidence of that, go look at those examples. Some of them are extraordinarily well documented and thoroughly researched, where a patient is on an operating table in an operating room after some kind of an accident or something, and they die. And it's not just that their heart stops, but their brain actually stops as well. And then later on, because doctors are getting really good at doing medicine, this person is able to be revived, and they've had no brain activity whatsoever. Their entire body is shut down, but the doctors are able to revive them. And if they can do that quickly enough, then you can do it without brain damage or serious brain damage. And so these people essentially are brought back to life through the wonders of modern medicine. And then they start reporting that they had experiences while their brain did not have activity, while there was no detectable electrical or chemical reactions going on in their brain. And sometimes they even report hearing and seeing things that were going on in the room while all their brain activity had ceased. And they report them to the doctors who were operating on them, and nurses who were operating on them, and the medical personnel are like, yeah, that was right. That actually is what happened. And that being the case, it would indicate that they were able to somehow perceive what was going on while their brain wasn't functioning and while their senses weren't functioning, which is a very strong indicator there's an immaterial aspect to human beings. There's something about us that's not reducible to our brains and our physical bodies, and there's something about us that survives medical death. And this is without even getting into all the good argumentation we can give as to why human beings have an immaterial aspect. And if you want to know more about that, go back and listen to the end of episode 43, where I laid out at least a few of the arguments that demonstrate that there's an immaterial aspect to human beings. Our thoughts, our consciousness is not reducible to just the material. And also, when Carroll makes the claim that we completely understand the physics that underline everyday life, he's at best making a gross overstatement. Now again, you try and interpret him fairly, he could mean, hey, we understand how gravity works, we understand how chemical reactions in the body work, we understand how digestion works, those things like that, how basic physics works. And that's for the most part true, but again, I think he's pulling kind of a sleight of hand there, because then he's implying, well, and we understand everything that could, in any sense, lead to an afterlife, which is just ridiculous. Of course we don't understand everything there is to understand about physics. Another physicist and cosmologist named George Ellis, I've heard he's regarded as one of the best cosmologists in the world. I think somebody said he knows more about cosmology than any other person alive. He said at one point a few years ago that he thinks we're approaching the end of physics. And now he didn't mean the same thing that Carroll means here. He didn't mean there's nothing more to know. We know everything there is to know about physics. He meant that he thinks we're approaching the end of what human beings are actually capable of learning about physics, and i.e., you can only build a Hadron Collider so large, and if you could build one as large as the solar system, there'd probably be some more things to learn, but you could, in theory, only build one as big as the Earth. There's practical limitations to what our knowledge is, and that includes the knowledge of physics, and that's the statement that Ellis was making. And some people even thought that was a bit of an overstatement, because, well, maybe there's going to be ways that come up of discovering things that even Ellis doesn't know about, even though he's probably the most knowledgeable physicist and cosmologist in the world right now. I mean, this guy worked with Stephen Hawking when Hawking was alive. So that would be a valid way of making his argument that isn't either begging the question or strawmanning the other position, but I'd still say it's wrong because its premises are, if not almost certainly, highly likely to be false. And so the reason I did this one this week is it's a good example of the fallacy of scientism, which I talked about 2 weeks ago, and depending on how you construe it, you can look at it as begging the question, or perhaps Dr. Carroll strawmanning the view that consciousness survives death and beliefs in the afterlife, because as far as I'm aware, there are a couple of Christian philosophers who are physicalists who think everything's explainable in terms of the physical, but they're in the vast minority, not majority. The vast majority of people who believe things like your consciousness survives death and there's an afterlife think it's immaterial. They think it has nothing to do with physics. So he's either begging the question in favor of his view, or he's misunderstanding and strawmanning the other view. And in that case, he's really somebody who should know better, having debated prominent Christian philosophers and apologists like William Lane Craig, and having gotten his undergraduate degree in philosophy. He should know better than making such a ridiculous argument as this. But that said, from what I understand, his work in cosmology and astrophysics is actually really, really quite good. So if you're interested in those kind of things, you should probably check him out for those types of things. Okay, so on to the argument against evolution from morality. Now, I guess I should first of all say what this is not. It's not the moral objection to evolution you sometimes hear from people who, loosely speaking, fall under the term young earth creationists. That is, argument that I often hear against evolution or the world being old from them is something along the lines of, well, if you take the view that the earth is billions of years old and things came about because of evolution, that means there was animal pain, death, and suffering before the fall of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Animal pain, death, and suffering, things like them getting cancer, them pursuing each other, eating each other, the lion eating the zebra, etc., something like that, is evil. Evil came about through the result of the fall, therefore that's wrong. Well, this has nothing to do with that type of argument. It's not related at all. Nor is this the moral argument for the existence of God. And actually, as I'm thinking about it, I haven't gone through the moral argument for the existence of God in this podcast before. That's, I think, the next one on my list when I do a segment on arguments for the existence of God. But it's not the same thing as that. If you want to know more about that, well, I guess do your own research or wait for me to do a segment on it. The next time I need some space filled up, I think that's a segment I'll do. But who knows? That might be a little while. Rather, what this argument is, and it's something that I've thought of and tried to develop on my own. To my knowledge, nobody else has done this, and it's definitely influenced by a lot of things. Like it's similar in some senses to Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, but it's doing something very, very different. And this argument is that it's highly, highly unlikely that Darwinian evolution would actually give rise to the morality that we actually see, observe, and experience in the world. It is the case that Darwinian evolution could give rise to a type of morality, but it's not the type of morality that we actually see and observe in the world, because the morality we see and observe in the world has certain properties that don't fit well with a Darwinian explanation of things. And now lots and lots of thinkers, both good ones that I respect and people who I would label poor thinkers who I respect as human beings but not as thinkers, have argued over and over again that morality is a byproduct of evolution. It's something that arose because it enables survival and reproduction. And so my argument is essentially against that, saying, well, no, the morality we observe doesn't fit with that at all. So to give you a sense of how this type of reasoning goes, what these types of people are saying, I'm going to play you two clips here of people who are arguing this. The first one is from Michael Shermer, who, if I remember correctly, is the head of the Skeptics organization in the U.S. I'm messing up the name, but anyhow, he goes around debating people who believe in theism or Christianity all the time, and he gives an account here in this debate he was having, I think, with Frank Turek, about how evolution gives rise to morality.
The individual is the primary moral agent because the individual organism is the principal target of natural selection and social evolution. So here's how we build and construct an objective moral system from the bottom up with selfish genes, with evolution, with natural selection. The first moral principle is to help yourself and your kin and your kind. Technically speaking, this is called kin selection. And from there, of course, you're going to be nice to your kin and kind, your immediate family, your parents, your children, your grandparents, your grandchildren, and so forth. The second moral principle is I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine. This is called reciprocal altruism. So even if I'm not genetically related to you, it pays for me to be nice to you, because when times are tough for me, it would be nice if you were nice to me. And we do this. We evolve this capacity to have moral emotions, to care about other people, to have empathy, to have sympathy, to bond with our fellow social primates. It's what we do. So the survival and flourishing of individual sentient beings is a basis for establishing objective morals. This is where I begin it in the moral arc. And so determining the conditions by which humans best flourish ought to be the goal of a science of morality. Okay, my point is, in my book, is that we've already been doing this for centuries. We've been devising experiments, social experiments, on how best we should live. Democracy is one of these social tools invented to figure out a way better than all the other ways before. Theocracies, autocracies, dictatorships, and so on lead to the loss of freedom and liberty, survival and flourishing. So in other words, female genital mutilation is morally, objectively wrong because it permanently robs individuals of their evolved sexual nature. That's part of their survival and flourishing. So morality is transcendent and objective in the sense of not being just a trait of individual humans, not just being you. It's a trait of the human species. It's what you get by being born human. It comes with the package. It's what our founding fathers meant when they said we have certain inalienable rights. Now, they were deists. When they said by the Creator, they meant in sort of a generic sense. They didn't know about evolution. That was before that theory was devised. But this is what the Creator is. We were created by evolution. Evolution created the moral emotions over millions of years in our Paleolithic ancestors. In other words, if you were just selfish, greedy, hoarding all the resources you possibly could in your little group, because that was the best thing for you to propagate your genes in the next generation, that won't work. That is not the most selfish thing you can do. That is not the best thing you could do for yourself, because everybody else in your group, if they're like you, they'll all be doing the same calculation. How can I exploit this guy to benefit myself? If everybody in the group thinks like that, there is no social group. It disintegrates into violence and chaos. The best thing you could do for yourself is to be nice to other people.
Okay, and here's another clip of Jordan Peterson making more or less the same point that Shermer was making, although Peterson's making it in, I would say, a much more sophisticated and nuanced manner.
Okay, so here's how it happens in an evolutionary sense. People, going all the way back to our primate forebears, organize themselves into functional hierarchies. Okay, and the hierarchies are complex, and they're not just based on power, despite what the idiot Marxists say. Even DeWall has noted that chimpanzee hierarchies are unstable if they're only based on power. They don't last. They degenerate into violence. So you have a hierarchy that works, but it's acted out. No one knows why it works. It works because everyone seems to be happy with it. Okay, and so those hierarchies get more complex and more sophisticated, and then people start to observe them and talk about them. It's like, oh, well, we've got this hierarchy here. What's it like? And then they spin off dramas about the hierarchy. Here's a hero who climbed up the hierarchy, and here's what a hero looks like. Okay, so then you get the idea of hierarchy, and then you get the idea of the hero as the person who moves up the hierarchy and generates it. Okay, then out of that, you get the extraction of the idea of the hero, and then you get development of that idea. And it's out of that you get the monotheistic religions. And so it's like the procedure and the hierarchy come first. No one knows what the rules are. It's all played out the same way that wolves play it out in a pack or chimpanzees play it out in a troop. Then we wake up and think, oh, we live in a structure. Here's the structure. That would be Osiris in the Egyptian mythologies. Here's the structure. Here's how the structure goes wrong. Here's what the structure does. Here's its tyrannical aspect. Here's what you have to do to generate the structure and to thrive in it. Okay, that's even more important. The hierarchy is important enough. But what we want to know is how to master the hierarchy. Okay, that's where you get the mythologies of the hero.
Okay.
And then, so then there's generates all sorts of different heroes because there's different ways of being successful. Then you have a panoply of heroes. Then you think, okay, well, now we've got all those heroes. That's a set. We can pull back and say, okay, something about all these heroes is what makes them heroes. That's when you extract out the monotheistic savior. Because that's why in Christianity, Christ is the King of Kings. It's actually, you can think about it as a literal statement. Forget about the religious overlay. It's like, okay, you got a bunch of people. Some of them are kind of king-like. Okay, so you admire them. It's like, for whatever reason that is.
Right.
It's not easy to figure out why you admire someone, right? That's complicated. But let's say you've got admirable people. You start telling stories about them. That's why you go to a movie.
Right.
You want to go watch someone you don't care about, you're bored by? No, you want to go watch someone admirable and interesting, or maybe the opposite of that. But it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. Then you think, okay, well, we've got all these admirable people. They're generating the world properly. That's what makes them admirable. There's a principle they embody. And that principle is the process by which the admirable world is generated. That's the logos.
Okay.
That's the thing that's operative at the beginning of time. The process by which the hierarchy itself and success within the hierarchy is generated, that's to be accounted over millions of years. At least hundreds of thousands of years. But I would push it back because you can see analogs in the chimps. So 20 million years, let's say. That's a long time. On that time scale, the fact that the Enlightenment values arose in Europe 500 years ago before anywhere else, it's like, well, who cares? It's 5 old men long, right? If you put 5 100-year-old men in line, it's like, it's yesterday. It's this morning. So we've evolved these hierarchical structures. That's our culture. We've evolved ways of maneuvering within the hierarchical structures that are successful. And now we've started to evolve ways of mapping our adaptation. Not just adapting, but mapping it. It took human beings a very long time to evolve their hierarchies, to evolve their structures of success, and then to have enough people around with enough spare time to engage in the cultural process of the artistic cultural process of mapping the adaptive structure. That all emerges in mythology and drama. Then that lays the groundwork for philosophy. Then the philosophers could come in, especially once it's written, like in the Judeo-Christian pantheon. It's like, oh, now we've got it written down. Oh, well, we don't have to remember it.
Right.
We can read it. And while we're reading, we can think about it. And so then out of that starts to come the semantic codes. Well, then you get the Enlightenment. I'm not making a reductionist argument. So the first thing is I'm going to say this is how religion evolved. But I'm not saying that this explanation exhausts the phenomenon, because it's a very strange phenomenon. It's very, very strange. But that doesn't mean we can't generate a plausible evolutionary account. Not an infinite variety of pragmatically applicable interpretations. You instantly constrain the universe to what? Well, this is why there's commonalities in mythologies. It's like if you put enough people together in enough different places, the commonality of the groups of people, because of the grounding in common motivation and emotion and embodiment, because we're embodied, means that they're going to generate hierarchies that are broadly similar, with strategies of success within those hierarchies that are broadly similar, with descriptions of the strategies that are broadly similar. And so you could say, in some sense, the ethic that gave rise to the Enlightenment is in place more or less everywhere. Now, it's tricky because not every hierarchical system is as functional as every other hierarchical system. Some of them can degenerate into tyranny. We're talking about the set of all voluntarily playable games.
Right.
Something like that, and that can degenerate. Out of that, you're going to get common hero myths. You have to.
Now, just for clarification, I know this clip from Peterson was a little bit long. It's actually part of a much, much longer talk that he was having with Ben Shapiro about evolution and morality, and I actually chopped it down. You may have noticed a few points where I chopped it out, because he tends to go on a long while, but I did the best that I could with what we had. Okay, so I hope you can see here how what Peterson and Schirmer are doing there is essentially more or less the same thing. They're essentially saying, hey, morality can arise evolutionarily from the fact that we live together socially, that human beings are social beings, and it just naturally arises through evolutionary processes. Now, obviously, as I said, Peterson's variant of it is a lot more compelling, a lot more nuanced, and a lot more sophisticated. But they're more or less arguing the same thing. Both of them are essentially saying that morality is as real as your hands and eyes, and it's the product of evolution. Now, generally speaking, I don't really care very much for Schirmer, but I do kind of like Peterson. Peterson seems to strike me as a genuine seeker of truth, and I've heard Schirmer engage in too many disingenuous arguments for me to think the same thing of him. That's kind of my own personal bias there, I guess you could say. But the point is, they're both essentially saying the same thing. Morality is the byproduct of evolutionary processes. And you also get examples of this from philosophers like Michael Ruse and the philosopher William Irwin. For example, Michael Ruse has actually said, and I quote, "Morality is a biological adaptation no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusionary. I appreciate that when somebody says, 'Love thy neighbor as thyself,' they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, any such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusionary." And so he takes that a little further than Peterson and Schirmer do. Essentially, he seems to be taking a non-moral realist position. And this isn't to say that Ruse doesn't behave in a moral way. In fact, I've heard him engage with people many times in debates and things like that, and he strikes me as a pretty decent and moral person. He's a guy who's well worth a philosopher who's well worth your time to read. If you come across any of his works, I'd highly recommend them. The ones of his that I've read are great. But anyhow, what he's meaning there is morals are not objective. They're things that you perceive, but they're just not objective, which some people argue would follow if they're evolutionary byproducts. I think Peterson and Schirmer would disagree and say, no, they're as real and they have as much of a foundation as our hands, feet, and teeth do. And I mentioned William Irwin. He takes a similar position in a book he wrote titled, what was that? The Free Market Existentialists, Capitalism Without Consumerism. And he essentially spends most of the book actually arguing for free market capitalism, or a libertarian variant thereof. And I actually met him when he was giving a talk on this book at a conference. Met him meaning I shook his hand and we exchanged a few words. And he takes an amoralist position in this book, which is more or less morality doesn't exist in the sense that people talk about it, because it's a byproduct of evolution. So he thinks there is no objective foundation for morality because it's a byproduct of evolution. So I bring up all these examples, Peterson, Ruse, Schirmer, and Irwin, to just give you a sense of this is how people talk about morality and what they mean by evolutionary morality. And it's I would say, very, very common view in the academy and in most of the soft sciences, pretty much anywhere where you're not connected to any type of religious or theistic thinking, that you're going to get the argument that, well, morals are just a byproduct of evolution, because if you view everything through an evolutionary framework, you have to explain everything through an evolutionary framework. We all tend to perceive morality. It's certainly something that a lot of humans claim to perceive, so it has to be explained through the evolutionary framework. So I'm sure you've noticed the divide there between the more academic philosophers like Ruse and Irwin, who are saying morality isn't real in the sense that people talk about it as being real, and guys like Peterson and Schirmer, who are actually moral realists, who think morals really do exist. There really is morality. And the argument I'm making really doesn't depend on where you come down on that. As a Christian philosopher, I definitely fall into the moral realist camp, but you could really go either way there, and the argument I'm making still is going to work fine under either position. In that case, I think the divide there is probably that guys like Irwin and Ruse, being philosophically trained, have seen the fact that it's very difficult to ground morality in any objective sense if it did arise evolutionarily, and if evolution is entirely or mostly a random process, because if it is a random process that's undirected and morality did arise through evolution, then it can't really be objective, because it could have turned out very, very different. If the conditions on Earth had been a little different when we'd have evolved with a very different morality. We'd have evolved with a morality like that of bees or termites or something along those lines, if we had evolved with different conditions. And if that's the case, then morality can't be objective in the sense that we mean objective. And so I think Ruse and Irwin are actually following the argument where it leads a bit better than Peterson and Schirmer are, even though I actually agree with Peterson and Schirmer more, because I'm quite convinced that morality is actually objective. Now, at this point, I hope I've drilled home this point quite well, that this is how a lot of people think about morality in regards to evolution, and this is why they think about it, because freely admit, in a certain sense, the story that Schirmer tells is fairly plausible. It makes perfect sense, and you can see how it would work for survival and reproduction if you had a group of pre-humanoid creatures who behaved cooperatively rather than competitively. Or, take Peterson's much more sophisticated and better version, where they behave simultaneously cooperatively and competitively. It's a game you play competitively that is also cooperative, and that's a much better variant there of it. So that's the first point I'm trying to drive home here, is it absolutely is the case that evolution can explain at least some aspects of morality. That certainly makes sense. And the reason why people have to explain morality is that it's everywhere around us. We all see it. It's as natural a human observation as saying, I see things. It's one of the ways we just naturally observe the world. The collective observation and sensation of the overwhelming majority of people who have ever existed is that objective moral values do exist. Now, obviously, no one's ever done a scientific survey of every single human being who's ever listed, but it's easy to imagine that if we were to do such a survey, somewhere over like 95%, possibly as much as 99% of the people who've ever lived would claim they observe and sense objective moral values, because that's the default you find everywhere. I know this because we always see claims about what is and is not right, what is and is not moral, and what is and is not just, all throughout recorded history in all cultures as best as I can tell. The most popular stories in every culture always include moral claims about what is and is not right. A hero needs to be right at least some of the time, and a villain needs to be wrong at least some of the time. This is very similar to what Peterson was saying about how stories and heroes arise. Obviously, if we don't have heroes and villains, then you get a very boring story. And very, very loosely speaking, you could call part of this idea natural law, the idea that there are natural laws, there's a natural moral order that people just naturally perceive, and the stories and mythos that all cultures have grow out of that. And sometimes they get it wrong, sometimes it goes badly, but you can find traces of that everywhere in every culture all the time. And C.S. Lewis actually came up with a term for this called the Tao, which is a Eastern term, I think it's Chinese, that means the way. And his point there was, you find the Tao in every culture, and what he meant by that was, you find this appeal to an overwhelming moral sense that is similar in every culture. An example of that from a book I was doing research in a while ago is a medical doctor was saying, there is no culture that praises lazy men and rewards cowards. Everybody thinks you shouldn't be lazy and you shouldn't be a coward, no matter where else they differ. So that'd be an example of that Tao that C.S. Lewis is talking about. And further, even guys like Roos, and I think, although I haven't heard him talk about this specifically, I think Irwin would actually tell us that they do observe and sense objective moral values, but they simply believe those observations are false and misleading. They're like a mirage in the desert or something. And the reason I can say this of Roos is that an illusion must be observed in order to be an illusion. So I think we can fairly say that for someone like Roos, objective moral values are just an elaborate mirage or hallucination or something like that. We think we are observing, sensing, and seeing these objective moral values, but they're not actually there, is Roos's point. And the main point I'm stressing right here is that even someone like Roos, who denies the existence of objective moral values, he's still sensing and observing those objective moral values. And that's why I think it's fair to say that well over 99% of people observe and sense moral values, because even the people who deny their existence sense them. They just think their sensations are wrong. Maybe there are some genuine psychopaths who do not observe moral values, but I think in that case we have good cause to think that person's brain or other parts of them are just not functioning properly, just the same way as a blind person's eyes don't function properly, so we wouldn't believe a blind person who says there's no such thing as sight. Blind people don't make us doubt the reality of eyesight, and likewise I don't think psychopaths should make us doubt the reality of objective moral values either. Now, this is typically where arguments will go about the moral argument for God, but I'm not going to get into that here. Rather, my point here is, and I did a little backwards. First, morality is something that needs to be explained because 99% of humans observe and sense it, or better. And even those who deny it observe and sense it, so it's a reality that you must face. You can bring evolutionary processes, Darwinian evolutionary processes into the mix, that is survival and reproduction, and you can explain a very simple moral system like what Schirmer was describing, like what Peterson is describing. They're relatively easy. But now the problem here is that there's a property or aspect to the moral system we observe which is not easily explained by evolutionary processes. That is, I think what Schirmer and Peterson are describing when they describe how evolution gives rise to morality is not a complete picture of the morality that we as human beings all see and perceive. They've left something very important and key out, and that is something that it's going to be, I think, at best, extremely difficult for evolutionary processes to explain. And so to explain this property, I'm actually going to turn to Paul's writing in the book of Romans, beginning in verse 15 of chapter 7. He says this, and I quote, "I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate I do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. As it is no longer myself who does it, but it is the sin living in me. For I know that good itself does not dwell in me, that is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do. And this I keep doing. Now if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is the sin living in me that does it." And obviously, since this is the Apostle Paul, he's couching that in the theological language in terms of sin, which, as a Christian theist, I generally agree with. But that's not the point I'm getting at here. The point I'm getting at here can be very well summarized by just his first point there. I do not understand what I do, for what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. The point being, morality has this odd paradoxical quality wherein we all have this sense of there are things that we should do, yet we find it very hard to do them and often don't want to do them. And for lack of a better term, I'm calling this Paul's paradox. So morality has this odd feature or odd property wherein people often find it very difficult to do what they actually believe to be morally right. So a man could be thoroughly convinced that it is immoral to be selfish and condescending, and yet still find that he is often selfish and condescending because he wants to. Another man may be equally convinced that it is immoral to engage in sexual acts outside of marriage, and yet still find that he does so, or it's very difficult for him not to, or that at least he's very tempted to do so because he fantasizes that that would be a very pleasurable thing to do, and so even if he doesn't do it, he feels the pull to go against what he believes to be morally right. This is an odd dynamic that, as best as I can tell, exists in every single moral claim you can make, both positive and negative. And by a positive claim, I mean something like you have an obligation to care for your children. A negative claim would be something like don't steal or don't murder. So I'm convinced that it is morally good for me to donate my time and resources to those who are less fortunate than me, and I think to some degree I probably even have a moral obligation to do that. It's not just commendable, but to some degree or other I probably have that obligation. And yet I often find that not only am I not doing this, but I don't want to. It's much more enjoyable to sit down and read a book or play a game or have a nice cup of coffee or drink or something. Now, as it's only interested in survival and reproduction, the standard Darwinian evolutionary mechanism of natural selection is almost certainly unable to account for this very odd dynamic. It's really, really easy to demonstrate how natural selection can explain things like desires for food or sex, as these desires obviously increase the chances of survival and reproduction. Likewise, it's very, very easy to see how these mechanisms can explain the existence of simpler, non-paradoxical morality, like what Schirmer and Peterson were talking about. Any group of organisms, be they things like human beings or lower creatures like crabs, I think Peterson likes to talk about lobsters from time to time, well, any one of them that attempt to cooperate in some sense, that's probably going to increase their likelihood of survival and reproduction, so natural selection could easily explain the existence and rise of any moral system that encourages such cooperation. However, I don't think it's at all easy to see or explain how natural selection would select for both a desire, or in this case, a morality, and the exact opposite of that desire. So how is it that natural selection would select for both the morality that says don't steal and don't kill and don't destroy, and the very opposite of that, which says, I bet if I could steal, kill, and destroy, it would make my life a lot easier. If moral thoughts and desires increase the odds of survival and were selected for this reason, why are the opposing desires also selected? If cooperation is good for a species, why did morality develop so that most people want to be selfish? The default in virtually everyone is selfishness. Go hang out with a bunch of toddlers and you're going to see that. It has to be trained out of them. As sexual desire increases the odds of reproduction, then why did the feeling that it needs to be restrained and or contained get selected for? And the point there is, one of the aspects that you find in C.S. Lewis's Tao is you go to virtually every culture, and there's some variance in this, but generally there's the idea that sexual expression needs to be constrained in some sense. And yeah, you look at like the kings and the people who have power in society, and they flaunt it all over. But generally speaking, the average person in your society, they're constraining it somehow, and usually within the confines of marriage or within some other type of relationship. But there's a general idea that you can't just go out and have sex with whoever, whenever you want, even if they're all willing. And that's pretty prevalent in pretty much every society I can think of, except for some aspects of American society now. And that one especially makes no sense as far as survival and reproduction, because, hey, you survive long enough to get to the point where you can reproduce. Wouldn't reproducing like mad increase the odds of reproducing? Well, obviously. So how did this idea that sexual expression needs to be constrained in somehow, which is found virtually unanimously in every culture to some degree or other, arise? It doesn't make sense. So that's my main point here is, it seems to me that if morality did actually arise due to evolutionary processes, then what we should actually observe is more or less everybody within the same culture having pretty much the exact same moral desires all the time. You're going to get variance as mutations come in, because you would assume that morality would evolve just like our body processes would evolve through mutation and variance, but you wouldn't get near the same variation that we do see, and further, you wouldn't find this odd dynamic, you wouldn't find Paul's paradox that, well, I have this overwhelming belief that I shouldn't just go sleep around, but part of my mind thinks, wouldn't that be awesome? Wouldn't that be wonderful? Wouldn't that be pleasurable? Rather, you should get one or the other, not both. And now, as I've thought about it, the only way that I've thought of that a proponent of evolutionary morality could still argue this if they account for Paul's paradox, that is, if they... Obviously, somebody could come along and just deny this completely, because that's one of the options you always have when you're in philosophy, is just deny the truth of whatever the other person is saying. But I don't think that's fair here, because this is a feature of morality that we see everywhere. A lot of the great stories we read about in literature and culture from all kinds of cultures involve this dynamic of, well, what I want to do, I don't do, and what I do, I don't want to do. How do I get better? How do I change? There's just this odd tension that we see Paul's paradox all over the place. So in order to overcome this problem, I think they'll need to resort to a bunch of ad hoc, or that is, just so stories, to attempt to explain how it might have been beneficial for evolution, for natural selection, for survival reproduction, to select both a desire, both this moral system, and its opposite. That is, they'll have to argue that, so in the example of a sexual desire, since it's so relevant here, they would have to argue something along the lines of, well, having sex too often decreases the odds of survival, which in many senses it actually does, but there must be some sex in order for there to be reproduction, obviously. So a desire for sex was selected for, along with the notion that sex needs to be restrained. Now, the obvious problem you should see there is that evolution, natural selection, doesn't care what you do after you reproduce. All it has to do is get you to the point where you reproduce. So why would it be selecting for features that increase your lifespan, make you more likely to survive, as well as reproducing? It should only be selecting for features that make you want to reproduce. And the larger trouble here is that the explanations like this, you'd have to give a different one for each aspect of morality you come across, because you wouldn't be able to apply this same explanation for things like, well, why do some people desire to steal? Why do some people desire to be selfish? Why do some mothers struggle with loving their children while others, even though they know they should, and that's the moral constraints on them? Well, you're going to have to give an ad hoc explanation or a just so story for every one of these. You don't have an overarching principle that you can apply to each one and say, there we go. You have to give an ad hoc explanation for each individual example. And that's because evolutionary mechanisms seem to be unable to offer any kind of meta explanation for Paul's paradox. And as I've gone over several times in this podcast, ad hoc explanations are, generally speaking, not good explanations. There are exceptions, and we could write in and ask me about that if you want to know about the exceptions. But if you have to apply a bunch of ad hoc explanations to save your theory, probably a good sign that there's something wrong with your theory. And so my contention here is you'd have to apply a bunch of ad hoc explanations to save evolutionary morality from Paul's paradox. And that's because it's highly unlikely that evolutionary processes would give rise to Paul's paradox, as it's very difficult to see how holding two simultaneously opposing desires will ever increase the odds of survival and reproduction. Conversely, it actually seems to me like holding two opposing desires will often lessen the odds of survival, so natural selection would probably wind up working against Paul's paradox. And yet we see Paul's paradox everywhere. I could cite you dozens of examples from literature, but then this podcast would go on way too long. Just look through the major stories you enjoy and the books you enjoy, and you're going to see examples of this. It's not just in the Bible, it's everywhere. So I've thought about ways of stating this argument more formally, and I can think of two ways. The first way is very, very similar to how Alvin Plantinga formulated his evolutionary argument against naturalism, and here's what we could say of this. If evolutionary processes gave rise to morality, so say if E led to M, then the odds that we would see Paul's paradox, which I originally thought I would label PP, but that has connotations completely outside philosophy, so let's just say P. So if E led to M, then the odds of P, that is Paul's paradox, would be very, very low, very, very unlikely. But there is P, there is Paul's paradox, it does exist, we see it everywhere. Therefore, very unlikely that E led to M. Or I think you could also postulate it in the sense of like an inference to the best explanation, and if you want to know more about that, I've done 2 episodes on that. One was on how inference to the best explanation demonstrates Christ rose from the dead, and then I got into inference to the best explanation when I talked about why conspiracy theories are almost always wrong. So I think you could do inference to the best explanation argument as well and say that evolution fails that test when it comes to explaining morality for all the reasons I just cited. So you have in morality you have in evolution certain mechanisms that depend on survival and reproduction and therefore are likely to give rise to things that increase the odds of survival and reproduction. You see in how humans perceive morality a property, Paul's paradox, that is unlikely to increase survival and reproduction and further is likely to decrease it. Therefore, evolutionary mechanisms are not a good explanation for morality. And so this is a bit like Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism, but not the same thing. I'm kind of appealing to the same sense, which is, well, Darwinian evolutionary processes can do some things, but can they really do everything? And in Plantinga's case, it was, can they really give us true beliefs? And I would say probably not. And in this case, I'm saying, can they really give us morality that includes Paul's paradox, that includes this very weird dynamic, which we all see, that what I want to do, I do not do, and what I do not want to do? Well, no, I don't see how, because it just doesn't seem to make sense. This has to come from somewhere else. So, as I close out here, let me talk about what the limitations of this argument are. So, if I'm right, if my intuition and my thoughts on this are right, well, what would it prove? Well, it wouldn't in and of itself disprove Darwinian evolution. All it would prove is morality did not arise through Darwinian evolution. So you then have to postulate that morality came from somewhere else. So you could, you could say it comes from something like Platonic forms, or you could appeal to something divine like God. There might be some other possibilities that are escaping my mind at the moment, but you just have to say The moral sense, the moral observations we human beings make, did not arise through evolutionary processes. But you could still say that our bodies arose through evolutionary processes, that all the animals and plants and stuff that we observe arose through evolutionary processes. It wouldn't disprove biological evolution in this sense. It would only prove morality didn't arise through evolution. So really what I'm arguing here is that evolution is just an inadequate explanation to account for the totality of the moral experience and observations we as humans have. Evolution can, I think, in theory, get us simple moral systems, like what Peterson and Schirmer are saying. That makes perfect sense. That's a plausible story. But it's extremely unlikely that evolution is going to get us a moral system that has Paul's paradox in it. Now, if you're listening and you're like, well, that's kind of depressing, that argument doesn't prove very much. Well, I think as a general rule, you should be very, very suspicious of any argument that proves a lot or too much. This is just an observation I've made as I've worked through arguments on, say, the existence of God and other things in philosophy. If an argument gets you all the way you want to go in just 3 or 4 lines, it's very, very likely there's something wrong with it. It's much better to proceed in your reasoning by slow, methodical steps than one grand argument. If one grand argument gets you everything you want, well, it's very likely there's something wrong with it. That's one of the reasons why, despite studying it a lot and not finding much I can point to that's wrong with it, I'm still a bit suspicious of the ontological argument, because an argument that gets you an all-perfect being in, I think you can reduce Plantinga's one to only about 7 steps, well, that seems a bit too convenient to me. So, well, I guess that's a little bit of a tangent. But anyhow, I'll sum up my main points here again. Virtually all human beings observe morality, somewhere probably 99% or more, and even those who deny that objective morality exists, they have these moral observations and intuitions. They just think they're illusionary or they're not real. Now, because of that, any system or totalizing explanation, that is something that's seeking to explain the totality of human experience, as a lot of times Darwinian evolution does, is going to have to account for the fact that we human beings observe morality and, generally speaking, think it's objective, think it's real. We think it's the same thing as me looking at my hand right now, me looking at the computer, you listening to my podcast right now. Now, Darwinian evolutionary processes are only geared toward survival and reproduction, which fails, is what I'm arguing, or is very inadequate to account for the problem of Paul's paradox, i.e., what I want to do, I do not do. What I do not want to do. It doesn't make sense that evolutionary processes geared toward survival and reproduction would simultaneously select for a desire and the opposite to desire. It doesn't make sense that evolutionary processes would simultaneously give us a moral system that says do that, and then put desires in us that says no, I don't want to do that. It'll be more pleasurable if I break the rules. You could maybe account for a little bit of that due to mutations and variations and evolution sort of testing the system against obstacles and boundaries and things like that. But you can't get that in every single human being. And every single human being that I've ever talked to and met has this dynamic in us. Now, we're going to vary as to far as where we have trouble following the moral system that we think we should, but everybody has problems with that. That's part of the human condition. And that doesn't make sense given evolutionary processes. Therefore, I think we can say very likely, very highly, evolutionary processes did not give rise to the moral system we human beings see and perceive, so it had to come from somewhere else. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole moral argument for the existence of God right now, because that would take us way, way over time, and it's pretty far along now. But a quote that I'd like to just sum this up with is, I think that claims about evolutionary morality can be best described as, and I quote here, the ludicrous overuse of evolutionary biology to explain everything about life, including the human mind. And that's from a gentleman named J. Bodzitsky from a book, What We Can't Not Know. I'm certain I mispronounced his name, but look up the book if you like. What We Can't Not Know. It's a pretty good book about how people who deny morality are essentially denying what we can't not know. So that's my moral argument against evolution, or you could call it the argument from morality against evolution. And that's probably a bit of an overstatement, because it's not really saying evolution doesn't happen. It's just saying morality can't come from evolution. So I'm going to try and think of a better name. And if you can think of one, write in and let me know. You can always reach me for any kind of comment or question at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com. And I started a Facebook group for the podcast called The Examined Life with Phil. That Facebook group is, we're not quite a year old now. I think I started it last January, so we're looking at about 11 months. And I try and post relevant, funny, interesting philosophical things up there, as well as just using it to promote the podcast. So if you follow that, you'll sometimes see a little bit of my thoughts on other things, sometimes see some memes that I think are funny, and you'll always see, every Friday, or at least roughly Friday, when the new podcast comes out. So leave a comment there or send me a message there if you have any questions as well. And, if you like the podcast, you think this is a good idea what I'm doing here, share it on your social medias, whether it be Facebook or Twitter. I loathe Twitter, but hey, if you're going to share my podcast on Twitter, I think I could be okay with that. So, and give it a rating, or like on whatever podcast service you like, whatever's appropriate there. And as always, thank you so very much for listening. I do enjoy doing this, and I very much enjoy getting your feedback. I will be back again next week, Thanksgiving week, with another podcast. And again, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to be doing, but I will have something ready for you then. So talk to you again next week. Thank you so much.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.